It's time for the 8-Minute Devotion. The 8-Minute Devotion is a daily message that fills you with hope and encouragement from the Word of God. Here's your host, Pastor Cameron Walcott.
Hello, and welcome back to the 8-Minute Devotion. So glad you've chosen to join us today. 8 minutes of hope, 8 minutes of life, 8 minutes of encouragement from the Word of God. What a blessing it is. What a privilege we can spend this time together. We've been on a series the last few weeks, Do Justly, Love Mercy, Walk Humbly. And we're looking this week at the third of these points in that verse, Micah 6 and verse 8, and that is to walk humbly with God. And today we're going to continue to consider humility. What does it mean to walk humbly with God? And we're going to talk today about vertical humility. In other words, our utter dependence on God. To have that relationship of humility, vertical humility between us and God, our utter dependence on Him. You know, yesterday we were looking at the Hebrew word sana, which is translated as humble in Micah 6 and verse 8. It's not used a lot of times in the Old Testament. Of course, it's not used in the New Testament. It's a Hebrew word, but it's not used a lot. But what the word is really about, it's about living with modesty and in a non-self-exalting way, to not draw attention to yourself. And Micah was telling the people in this context of vertical humility, our dependence on God. Micah was reminding the people of Israel when he used this word. He's saying, look, I don't need your religious showmanship. I don't need you to draw all the attention to yourself. I need a God-centered walk. I don't need the noisy worship, the look at me. You know, in the age we live in, and in the church in the time we live in, how often has our worship sort of strayed from what it should be? How often has our worship become about the lights and the music and the sound? How often has it become about the musicians saying, look at me? And I'm not saying this is about all or even most musicians. You know, many have pure hearts before God, but yet have we created a system that exalts the man and exalts the woman on the stage and exalts the one with the instrument instead of the worship. You know, I just saw a post online talking about we need electric guitar players, and oh, don't worry, it's a paid gig, they call it, and we need you every Sunday. And is that what church is supposed to be? That you come every Sunday just to play your guitar, just to get paid to be part of the band? I don't think that's what the Lord desires. Now, of course, the workman is worthy of his wage. And at times, you know, the Bible does support paying leaders in the church, but we need to have the right attitude in all of this. It reminds me sometimes, this focus on self reminds me of Amos 5:21-24, where the Lord tells the Israelites, He says, I hate your feast days. I hate your noisy worship. You're putting on a show. I don't need your show. I want your hearts, and I want righteousness to rain down. I want you to remember the poor and needy. I want you to do justice. You know, Amos 5, it really links well with this Micah 6, because the Lord is saying it's not about the show and the noisy worship. It's about humbly serving others, doing justice. The Lord desires justice and righteousness, and that only will really happen when we start from a position of humility. We need to start with humility, and that vertical humility. We are dependent on God. We're not dependent on having the best band. We're not dependent on the smoke machine. We're not dependent on having the best lights. We're not dependent on having a paid musician at every part of the band. We are dependent on having God's presence. We're dependent on pleasing God. You know, I think sometimes we put ourselves in a position that we think we can do things without God. We think we can go on and do church and serve the Lord without His help. And we wouldn't actually say that, but our actions show that that's our actual belief. Our actions show that we're not really relying on the Lord, but we're relying on self, and we're relying on money, and we're relying on talent, and we forget that everything we have, it comes from God, and we cut ourselves off from His life and His help through our arrogance. But I think we need to adopt this attitude that I will walk humbly with God. I will remember my constant need for God's grace. I love what the Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 10. The Apostle Paul said this, "But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me." The Apostle Paul, he had done so much. He had started churches around the world. He had healed the sick. He had raised the dead. He was going to write much of the New Testament. But yet, what does Paul say? It's only by the grace of God that I am what I am. It's only by God's grace. It's not because of me. It's not because of my talents, my abilities, my past in the Old Covenant law where I knew it all, read it all, followed in the straightest, strictest sect. It's only by the grace of God. Paul does concede, yes, I did work hard, but it was God's grace working through me, God's grace energizing me, God's grace helping me. That was the testimony of the Apostle Paul. Friends, we need to have vertical humility before God. God, it's all about you. It's not about me. It reminds me also of the story of D.L. Moody. D.L. Moody was a great revivalist in the 19th century. He preached and, was famous preaching in the city of Chicago. Saw thousands and thousands of people, tens of thousands, come to salvation through his ministry. The Lord sent a mighty revival. But one night, D.L. Moody and his friends were walking down the street after one of the services, and they saw a drunk man staggering down the street. And, this man was clearly drunk. This man clearly was wasting his life. And, it was a terrible thing to see. And some of D.L. Moody's friends, they pointed to the man and they said, "Isn't that sad? Look at that man throwing his life away. Look at that man giving into sin and drunkenness. Look at the terrible choices that man has made." That was the attitude of D.L. Moody's friends. But do you know what D.L. Moody did? He pointed towards that drunk man and he said these words, "There but for the grace of God go I." In other words, D.L. Moody said, if it wasn't for God's grace, I would be that drunk man. I would be in that same position. I would be having that same struggle. If it wasn't for the grace of God, that would be me. There but for the grace of God go I. And he had this revelation. I'm completely and utterly dependent on God. Yes, I'm the great preacher. So many have been saved, but it's only because of God. I'm completely dependent on his grace. May we all have that revelation. May we all have that realization. We are completely dependent on the grace of God. Every good thing we do is only through his grace. Thank you for watching and listening. We'll be going deeper on this tomorrow on the 8-Minute Devotion.
Thank you for listening to the 8-Minute Devotion. Please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen to or watch it. And email us at the8minutedevotion@gmail.com with any questions or comments. May God bless you